Chapter 2: Transnational Terrorist Network of Anti-Cult Organizations.
You'll be surprised to know how many tragic events worldwide are behind the anti-cult movement. Using special manipulative methods, they are currently preparing American society for a full-scale civil war. And now you will find out how it's being done.
Hidden mechanisms of inciting hatred.
Dear Americans, you see and feel the presence of an unprecedented huge division in present-day American society. I'm sure you understand perfectly well where it all leads to, and you already suspect that there are hidden mechanisms used against you to incite hatred in American society. What are those mechanisms? Who uses them and why? Who teaches Americans to hate and demonize each other, seeking to ignite a second civil war in our country? And how actively is this being done? You will now receive answers to these questions. Dear Americans, you will find out exactly how you are being led today from the point where you are peacefully sitting on a couch and watching a movie together with your friends, to the point where you would be ready to take up arms against those same friends just because they have a different opinion. Perhaps this idea seems unimaginable to you now, but you will see how manipulative methods are already artificially guiding you towards that. One of the main methods that the enemy of democracy uses nowadays, both against you and against the whole world, provoking hatred in societies in various countries and unleashing regional conflicts and global wars, is the method of dehumanization. By deliberately dehumanizing one group of people in the eyes of another, people are turned into haters of their colleagues and neighbors, and even into their potential killers, which is far worse. In order to attain dehumanization and division in society, the enemy uses the tactics of stigmatization and labeling, and one of the labels the enemy uses in its global bloody game with human lives is the word cult. You'll be shocked to discover how much suffering the deliberate use of the degrading label cult or sect has caused to people, and how many tragedies it has brought and keeps bringing to the American people and the world as a whole. At first glance, it seems that these are just words. However, with the help of these very labeling words, America is now being driven closer to civil war, while the entire global community is being led to World War III. Who uses these labels, and why, and how are they used as weapons of mass destruction?
Today, a well-coordinated transnational terrorist network operates in the international arena, the purpose of which is to incite hatred both within countries and in the global community, by labeling certain groups of people as a cult or a sect, through mass media and information space. The criminal network engaged in this form of information terrorism is the anti-cult movement. The anti-cult movement includes a number of organizations and individual activists who trigger public persecution of groups which they label as cults or sects. Based on their subjective biases and arbitrary criteria, anti-cultists can classify any existing association of people as a cult or a sect, thus subjecting it to dehumanization and public hatred. The core of their activity lies in organized influence on the media space for the purpose of generating a negative perception of a particular targeted group of people. Using the word cult or sect as their main weapon, adherents of the anti-cult movement carry out regular information terrorist attacks. They generate news stories that cause moral panic, societal division, and dehumanization of law-abiding citizens. Through their activities, representatives of the anti-cult movement incite mass hatred and violence and increase social hostility and tension in society, which actually makes their activities a brutal manifestation of information terrorism.
Most often, new religious movements and ideological group entities initially became victims of anti-cult terrorism. Commercial, secular, and political organizations with a pronounced ideological basis were also regularly included in the black list maintained by anti-cultists. However, today, entire nations and countries, including the United States, are already becoming targets of their atrocities. Using the term cult or sect, they create conditions for directing public hatred at their chosen target. The purposeful use of the terms cult and sect is part of a long-term strategy of the anti-cult movement, which resulted in the emergence of a number of destructive phenomena in American society, including school shootings. A little bit later, I'll reveal to you the chain of events where the use of the labels cult and sect led to a situation when children are now shooting other children.
Why is cult a key word in the activities of anti-cultists, and why is it so dangerous? The term cult, which is more common in the US, and the term sect used in Europe and post-Soviet countries, didn't initially have a negative meaning, but rather a neutral and culturological one. However, through the efforts of anti-cultists, the situation has changed. In the course of their hectic activities, representatives of the anti-cult movement gradually endowed the concepts of cult and sect with an increasingly negative connotation. Due to their activity, today the terms cult and sect are associated in mass consciousness with such notions as brainwashing, psychological violence, sexual violence, criminal activity, and mass suicide. It is precisely with the words cult and sect that massive information terrorism begins nowadays, carried out by anti-cult organizations and their representatives. James Richardson, a prominent figure in American sociology of religion, who is regarded as one of the most outstanding experts in the field of law and religion in the world, notes that contemporary usage of the term cult has evolved into a term of contempt or humiliation, and is no longer a neutral designation of a religious group. Nowadays, the term cult carries a value-laden set of derogatory stereotypes. The use of this term leads to stigmatization, discrimination, and violence against religious minorities, as well as social and political associations. Moreover, today the words cult and sect are impregnated with negative connotations to such an extent that they become catalysts for terrorist attacks and even genocide. Richardson and a number of other sociologists and researchers of religions, such as Baron Van Driel, Stuart Wright, and others, point out that the term cult or sect is disparaging and conveys a stereotype which has serious consequences when applied to groups of people. Labeling a group as a cult or a sect can be an excuse for the government to attack the group and ultimately destroy it.
Despite the fact that reputable world scientists warn that the use of the word cult or sect causes great harm to people and should be avoided, especially in academic literature and court proceedings, representatives of the anti-cult movement continue to actively exploit this label and propagate it through the media, turning magazines and newspapers into mouthpieces of their hateful rhetoric.
When claiming that someone belongs to a cult or a sect, anti-cultists base their accusations not on academic papers or legal investigations, but on their own dubious and abstract concept of brainwashing. This idea has no scientific ground and is extremely vague. Nevertheless, exactly on the basis of the unreliable concept of brainwashing, anti-cultists label targeted groups and organizations as cults or sects. Brainwashing is an unscientific concept where the so-called cults and sects are accused of rigidly controlling the consciousness of their participants, which is why people can allegedly turn into zombies due to manipulation of their beliefs, thoughts, and behavior. Not only is this concept untenable, but it is also extremely dangerous as it leads to dehumanization. When society believes that an individual has been brainwashed, people stop regarding him as a sane individual. Instead of a human with his own thoughts and decisions, others begin to perceive him as a zombie or a puppet. Meanwhile, with such a perception of a person or a group of people, it is much easier to use violence against them. Forensic psychologist Dick Anthony states that the concept of brainwashing and the fear associated with it are used by the anti-cult movement as a tool to justify persecution of religious minorities. The court determined that the concept of brainwashing cannot be applied as a legal charge since it is untenable and unscientific. However, despite this, American anti-cultists continued to actively promote the concept of brainwashing to justify their sadistic practice of forcible deprogramming, meaning forced renunciation of beliefs, which among other things brought them commercial benefits. The destructive concepts of brainwashing and deprogramming have been introduced and are actively promoted by henchmen of the enemy of democracy in America, representatives of the anti-cult movement. The two figures who are especially notable for their cruelty and inhumanity and who spread the enemy's narratives on American territory are anti-cultists and deprogrammers Steven Hessen and Rik Alън Ros. Currently, they are actively engaged in public activities and speak in American mass media, where they propagate the rhetoric of anti-cult terrorism, violence, and hatred. Deprogramming. Both Ross and Hessen were active members of the anti-cult organization Cult Awareness Network, CAN, which ceased to exist in 1996, as it was convicted of a number of gross violations of human rights and severe religious discrimination. The organization went bankrupt and paid compensation to the people who had suffered from it. Being the leading members of this organization in the 1980s and 90s, both Rick Ross and Steven Hessen were actively involved in its primary criminal activity, arranging and carrying out forcible deprogramming processes. Deprogramming is an illegal anti-human practice rooted in Nazi methods. When practicing deprogramming, anti-cultists would unlawfully abduct and forcibly detain a person whom they considered to be a cult member or a sectarian. In the process of deprogramming, the victim was subjected to psychological and physical torture to force them to change their beliefs. Deprogramming was done on a commercial basis. Anti-cultists charged a fairly high fee from the victim's relatives for their forcible re-education services, during which a person usually underwent torture, torments, beatings, and various forms of violence, including sexual violence. Since this practice severely violated human rights, the founder of this method, Ted Patrick, appeared in court many times and served prison terms. In a number of trials, courts have ruled that deprogramming is illegal. Rick Ross, the American anti-cultist, performed more than 500 forcible deprogramming sessions in his life. In 1991, Ross was charged with unlawful detention and forcible deprogramming of Jason Scott, a member of the United Pentecostal Church International, UPCI, whose mother was referred to Ross by representatives of CAN. Scott later filed a civil suit against Ross, two of his associates in CAN, in federal court. In September 1995, a 9-member jury unanimously held the defendants, Ross and his accomplices, liable for conspiracy to deprive Scott of his civil rights and religious liberties. In addition, the jury held that Ross and his associates, quote, intentionally or recklessly acted in a way so outrageous in character and so extreme in degree as to go beyond all possible bounds of decency and to be regarded as atrocious and utterly intolerable in a civilized community. Ross's criminal activities in this abduction case resulted in the closure of the Cult Awareness Network, which was exposed as a criminal network for kidnappers. The story of Scott, who became a victim of brutal deprogramming arranged by Ross, is striking in its cruelty. He was abducted using physical force. They knocked him down to the ground, dragged him into a van, handcuffed him, taped his mouth, and tied his legs. During the abduction, a 300-pound man sat on Scott's back. Scott's legs, upper body and back suffered multiple bruises and abrasions when he was being dragged into the van by stairs, on the floor, and through a patio. Scott was detained in a specially equipped prison house under constant supervision. For 5 days, he was subjected to psychological pressure. They insulted his faith and threatened him. Ross regularly hit Scott on the head when they argued about religion. Scott was promised freedom only if he would give up his beliefs. A detailed study of the effective cases of deprogramming carried out by Rick Ross reveals the terrible truth. Many of those cases were accompanied by destruction of families and complete dehumanization of the victims. The people whom he allegedly helped in this way were subjected to coercion, deception, and humiliation. They were deprived of their right to free choice and forced to renounce deeply rooted religious beliefs. These people who were broken and lost faith became living evidence of the cruelty and treachery of Ross's methods. His demonstrative successes in deprogramming were covered with a shadow of ruined destinies and irreparable psychological traumas. Ross used people's fears and weaknesses with cold logic in order to profit from their troubles, demonstrating complete indifference to the suffering he caused. His actions are clearly characterized by violence, cruelty, and cold-bloodedness that turn people's misfortune into a source of his own benefit. The second figure and henchman of anti-cult movement in America is deprogrammer Steven Hessan. American mass media give him a platform to speak as a cult expert, but they do not mention that Steve Hessan's expertise is violent abuse against American citizens and their civil rights.
Hessan was an accomplice in the Cult Awareness Network. This anti-religious hate group served as a national referral service for so-called deprogrammers. They ran a racket to kidnap, assault, and traumatize law-abiding men and women for profit, all to coerce them into recanting their religious beliefs. And Steve Hessan is a notorious deprogrammer. Hessan led the squad that traumatized one adult victim, Arthur Roselle, for 2 weeks to try and break the man's faith. In sworn testimony, Roselle recounted his physical and mental assault. Hessan's team threw him to the floor, cutting and bruising his face. They bound his hands and feet and held him captive for days on end. They deprived him of sleep and violated his privacy and basic dignity. When Roselle refused to recant his religious beliefs, Hessan threatened to inject him with shots. And to add insult to injury, Hessan tried to induce his victim to lie and commit perjury about the crime. Then there was the testimony of Lauren Sala. Hessan's team broke into her motel room, threw her from the bed, and threatened to break her leg if she called for help or tried to escape. They took her hostage and drove her to a remote hideaway, where they imprisoned her for 8 days, trying to break her faith. When Hessan's thugs failed, he tormented Sala for 3 more days, until she managed to negotiate her release. Another of Hessan's victims, Claire Kelly, also testified that Hessan unlawfully held her captive. He had her held in a room with no knobs on the windows, kept her under 24-hour guard, and violated her privacy. Hessan pawned himself off as a, quote, expert on religions in court cases, bilking unsuspecting families for his so-called expert testimony, until courts caught on to his crackpot theories. Hessan would continue his anti-religious assaults, now under the name of intervention.
It is excessively alarming and suspicious that despite documented evidence that both Hessan and Ross are violent individuals prone to sadism, who lack empathy and have an unhealthy desire to harm people and incite hatred in society, they continue to appear on America's mainstream TV channels. There, their articles are published in leading periodicals, and mass media are guided by their opinions. A legitimate question arises: who is behind them and ensures their immunity? What is the force that manipulates and supports them? After all, in the beginning of their work before the early 90s days, neither Rick Ross nor Stephen Hassan were of much interest with their theories. However, starting from 1993, the media and even the FBI suddenly began to turn to them for advice. Did they conduct their destructive activities and perform deprogramming sessions simply because they were maniacs? Or did their actions contribute to implementation of a clearly defined plan of the enemy of democracy, which has brought America to the current state of panic and division? Both statements are true. The global enemy regarded the manic potential of these two fellows as a suitable material for turning them into its pawns, who are easy to manipulate and whose hands can destroy America from within. Activities of American representatives of the anti-cult movement are part of a planned strategy. Both Steve Hassan and Rick Ross are executors of the plans of America's enemy. What they currently implement, continuing to promote and impose the ideology of hatred and division, is nothing but information terrorist attacks aimed against the American population and against the USA as a country, even though they stopped using violent deprogramming techniques with their own hands. They receive support from the global enemy of democracy. So today, they continue deprogramming on an even larger scale and against a greater number of innocent law-abiding citizens. It's just that now, they are not doing it with their own hands, but with your hands and the hands of law enforcement agencies. A vivid illustration is that 30 years ago, in the early 90s, the number of violent raids on new religious movements increased dramatically and inexplicably for many people. Research that established this fact included statistics from 19 different countries, including the USA, Israel, and Western European countries. Wondering about the reasons behind such an upsurge, researchers traced a mobilization of anti-cult organizations, which occurred during that very period of time. However, the main essence and cause remained hidden for the researchers. The clue is that during this period of time, to be more precise in 1993, the global enemy of democracy activated its ideological center of the anti-cult movement, which has been located in Russia since that moment to this day. It is exactly from there that commands are given from, and a single ideological vector is set for the entire anti-cult movement worldwide, extending to its entire network. Now, using the example of this ideological center, let's discuss in detail how it operates in the country that it has turned into a testing ground for practicing its methods, which it plans to transfer and apply throughout the world in the near future.
Ideological center of anti-cult groups. The ideological center of the entire transnational network of contemporary anti-cult movement, and the chief developer of its propaganda methods, is the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects, abbreviated as RATSEERS. The basis of RATSEERS is the Center for Religious Studies in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus of Lyon, established in 1993. This center was founded by the anti-cultist Alexander Dvorkin with the blessing of the then Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Alexei II. RATSEERS representatives cover their activities under the guise of an allegedly noble mission of defending the interests of the country's titular religion, namely Orthodox Christianity. However, the real situation is far more complicated. Within the religion itself, there are individuals who, while outwardly adhering to orthodoxy, actually support anti-cult movements. These individuals act in unison, pursuing their own goals and benefits, which have nothing to do with religion itself. Therefore, it's crucial to distinguish between religion as a system of values and beliefs and those who have infiltrated it with malicious intent to use it as a cover for their destructive activities. These anti-cult operatives and their allies within the Russian Orthodox Church have turned this country into a staging ground for their activities and launched a targeted terrorist attack on democratic countries from there. The radical ideology of Ratziers, which originated in Russia, now extends its influence far beyond its borders. Anti-cult organizations hold particularly strong positions in China, France, and Germany, where they have secured significant support from authorities or individual representatives. This support allows them to exert influence over legislative, judicial, and law enforcement bodies. One of the prominent representatives of this international terrorist network is the European Federation of Centers for Research and Information on Sectarianism, FECRIS, headquartered in Paris. France, a country with a long tradition of democracy, has unexpectedly become part of the criminal anti-cult movement scheme, with 90% of FECRIS's activities funded by the state budget. Additionally, anti-cult activities are institutionalized in France through the Interministerial Commission Miviludes. However, the actions of this commission, as well as those of FECRIS, have repeatedly faced criticism from the international community, including for employing violent deprogramming methods, forcing individuals to renounce their beliefs through literal tortures against members of various religious groups. Both FECRIS and Ratziers comprise a number of organizations. The FECRIS and Ratziers networks are closely interconnected. They operate under a unified policy, use identical methods, and maintain close relationships. For instance, Alexander Dvorkin, president of Ratziers and Russia's leading anti-cultist, also served as vice president of FECRIS and still remains a member of its board of directors. Additionally, Ratziers' vice president and Dvorkin's associate, Orthodox archpriest Alexander Novopashin, is also a corresponding member of FECRIS. Currently, the participation of Ratziers' representatives within FECRIS has been officially suspended. This was done to conceal the influence of Russian participants on FECRIS's ideology and to avoid accusations of active support for Russian propaganda against Ukraine during the escalation of the military conflict between these two countries. Despite their official charters, claiming adherence to international conventions on human rights and freedoms, the reality is that anti-cult organizations operate in a starkly different manner. Since their inception, these anti-cult organizations have repeatedly discredited themselves through anti-democratic and unlawful activities, which include the deliberate spread of lies and slander, intentional incitement of violence, the use of destructive manipulative techniques, the instigation of conflicts fueled by interreligious hatred, and the targeted persecution of dissenting groups, sometimes even leading to physical assaults. Officially, the anti-cult umbrella organization FECRIS includes groups based in Europe, while Ratziers encompasses organizations in Russia and the CIS countries. Both associations actively collaborate with anti-cultists from the United States. American anti-cultist Stephen Hessen has attended conferences organized by FECRIS. Hessen was also a guest lecturer at one of educational clubs in Russia, where the anti-cultist Alexander Dvorkin is a regular lecturer too. Moreover, Hessen has repeatedly traveled to Russia with his lectures at the invitation of Russian anti-cultists. Dvorkin published a book titled 10 Questions to an Obtrusive Stranger, which entirely mirrored a chapter from Hessen's book. Moreover, Dvorkin actively recommends Hessen's books, and their rhetoric about the dangers of cults is identical, often echoing each other word for word. This synchronization of narratives indicates regular information exchange and collaboration, suggesting a direct and close relationship between Hessen and Dvorkin. A closer examination reveals the influence of the anti-cult ideological center on both social and political processes in the United States. This will be discussed in more detail later. Another fact pointing to the influence of the anti-cult ideological center on the U.S. is that in the 1990s, American newspapers, including prestigious outlets like the New York Times, suddenly began actively quoting Alexander Dvorkin and his subjective assessments of so-called cults, not only in Russia, but in other countries as well. Doesn't it seem odd that the comments of a Russian cult expert suddenly appear in such well-known newspapers as the New York Times? It's noteworthy that the views and comments of a relatively unknown Russian cult expert were featured in the New York Times. Despite the usual difficulty of achieving such exposure, even for top-level experts. This could be the result of financial investments, or bribery of the media, or even the presence of certain influence agents within the media. Regardless, this indicates the existence of a coordinated force to integrate the opinions of Russian extremist anti-cultists into American publications. Now, using the activities of the umbrella organizations Fekris and Ratsiers and their leaders as examples, let's examine the criminal methods of their operation, which might qualify the activities of anti-cult organizations as terrorist acts. How do anti-cult organizations operate, and what is their role in executing the enemy's global plan to destroy democracy?
In the flood of news, many of you have come across terms like destructive cults, totalitarian sects, or even killer cults.
Dangerous and abusive cult.
Totalitarian cults.
Cults. The word cult.
The cult. Cult.
Shocking cults.
Representatives of anti-cult organizations label selected groups without relying on factual evidence, police investigations, or thorough complex theological analysis. Instead, they follow entirely different playbooks which have no relation to theoretical science or even to objective reality.
While the term cult is a key stigmatizing term in the United States, in Europe and the post-Soviet countries, this role is played by the term sect, especially totalitarian sect, which also carries a strong derogatory and stigmatizing connotation. Since 1993, anti-cult movement ideologue Alexander Dvorkin has widely introduced the term totalitarian sect into post-Soviet media. The term totalitarian, borrowed from political science and propaganda language of the Cold War era, evokes associations with oppression, camps, imprisonment, barbed wire, forced labor, and meager food. Thus, this term is used to incite fear, anxiety, and a biased attitude toward the members of organizations labeled as totalitarian sects. The vagueness of the terms totalitarian sect and destructive cult allows anti-cultists to baselessly categorize any organization under these labels.
However, the use of terms such as sect, cult, totalitarian sect, and destructive cult is not supported by the laws of most countries or international legal documents. These terms lack legal justification, and their use contradicts the legislation on freedom of conscience and religious associations. Nonetheless, anti-cultists continue to use these terms as weapons of accusation and incite the media to use them.
The illegal activities of the anti-cult movement do not go unnoticed both internationally and within Russia, where representatives of academic and legal circles highlight the fraudulent and criminal nature of anti-cult organizations in general, and their chief ideologue, Alexander Dvorkin, in particular. Alexander Dvorkin's activities are also condemned in the United States, where a legal assessment of him was provided in a special report for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, USCIRF. The main responsibilities of this commission include reviewing the facts and circumstances of universal religious freedom violations and making policy recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and Congress. Here are some findings and recommendations provided by Jason Morton, a policy analyst for the USCIRF, in a report titled The Anti-Cult Movement and Religious Regulation in Russia and the Former Soviet Union. Dvorkin has long provided the anti-cult movement with a veneer of intellectual credibility. Alexander Dvorkin and his associates have carved out influential roles in government and society, shaping the public discourse on religion across numerous countries. Claiming to be experts in academic fields like religious studies, psychology, and sociology, they are rarely qualified in any of them, and often rely on discredited theories and methodologies to promote their ideological agenda. The anti-cult movement is fundamentally a propaganda outlet, conducting a highly effective information war against religious minorities throughout Russia and many of the countries in which it retains influence. The US government should publicly censure Alexander Dworkin and the St. Irenaeus of Lyon Information Consultation Center, SILIC, for their ongoing disinformation campaign against religious minorities. Counter propaganda against new religious movements by the European Federation of Research and Information Centers on Sectarianism, FECRIS, at the annual OSCE Human Dimensions Conference, with information about the ongoing involvement of individuals and entities within the anti-cult movement in the suppression of religious freedom.
Thus, representatives of the anti-cult movement do not hold a scientific position or have research motives, although they often disguise themselves as such. In reality, they intentionally introduce the concepts of destructive cults and totalitarian sects into the information space, using them to incite hatred and religious intolerance in society. The criteria and accusations they use to classify certain organizations as cults and sects are not recognized both in academic circles and within the legal framework. Attaching a harshly negative label is the first step in a systematic scheme of conducting information terrorist attacks. The goal is to transform followers of peaceful organizations and law-abiding citizens into objects of hatred and hostility without any factual basis.
Dehumanization. The process of dehumanization is the first step in the actions of anti-cult organizations aimed at eliminating those they find undesirable. This method is used to push the victim out of the social field, making them highly vulnerable. After all, if a group of people or an individual is labeled a cultist or cult member, the victim immediately loses his or her human image. This stigmatization creates the conditions for further violations of human rights and freedoms. Dehumanization serves to justify future crimes, dull the conscience and critical perception among the population. Dehumanization is the processing of society to accept and participate in future crimes. Presently, anti-cult terrorists have managed to implant the following mindset in the masses: cultist equals non-human. To achieve their goals, representatives of anti-cult organizations utilize the media, propaganda, the dominant religion in their country, law enforcement agencies, and even governmental structures.
Totalitarian sects are dangerous. They pose a significant social threat.
When most people use the word cult to define a group, they mean a destructive cult. Cults that hurt people through abuse. This could be physical, mental, emotional, sexual, or financial exploitation. Often deceptive, coercive, abusive, and relentlessly authoritarian.
A myriad of different types of mind control cults. There are religious cults and therapy cults and business cults and political cults, cults of personality with a...
Any cultic structure always fights against society, demonizing and speaking negatively about it, which is natural. And studying the history of any given cult organization, we understand the serious threat they pose on a personal level, at the family level, societal level, and even at the national security level. The goal of any cult is power and money.
Each totalitarian sect that is a cult has global plans. Each totalitarian sect strives for power and control over the world and over everyone. That's what makes them cults. They may temporarily cooperate with each other as long as they have a common enemy. And this common enemy for them is primarily orthodoxy.
Right now, while you were listening, some of you might have had thoughts in the background like, what's wrong with what the anti-cultists are saying? Cults are indeed dangerous. And all cult members are brainwashed, foolish, or deceived people. You might be surprised when I tell you that these thoughts are not your own personal convictions, These thoughts are actually the result of the anti-cultists' efforts to artificially implant these destructive images into your subconscious through the information field. Many of you, when hearing the words cult or sect, recall real examples of dangerous cults you have heard about in the media, whose activities have caused harm to people and society. The term cult is associated with personal danger, images of mass suicides, women who have been victims of sexual exploitation, the erratic behavior of cult leaders bordering on psychopathy, and zombified followers who unquestioningly give all their money and property to their leader. However, think about how long ago did you meet such things in real life, and what is your knowledge of new religious movements, aside from the negative images spread by anti-cultists? Of course, it must be acknowledged that among the founders of new religious movements, there are individuals engaged in fraud and deliberately exploiting the trust of citizens for personal gain, including committing illegal acts and crimes. But how can representatives of anti-cult organizations help in this situation? These cases should be handled by law enforcement agencies, since they bear the main responsibility for protecting citizens from such threats. In such cases, they must conduct the necessary investigation, collect evidence of illegal activity, and only after that should all perpetrators be prosecuted according to the law and the criminal organization be terminated. However, when it comes to anti-cultists, everything happens in reverse order. First, they make baseless accusations and attach labels comparable to accusations of committing grave crimes, and only then do they seek the involvement of law enforcement agencies and the initiation of criminal cases. However, the majority of such cases are based not on facts or results of objective investigation, but on rumors, slander, false testimonies, and labels affixed by anti-cultists. This particular characteristic of the strategy employed by all anti-cult organizations reveals their actual goals and intentions. They do not aim for an objective analysis of religious organizations to identify potentially dangerous ones. Instead, they are focused on discrediting and shutting down any groups they choose as targets. They achieve this by violating basic rights and freedoms, employing a range of manipulative methods, smear rhetoric, and hate speech. Because their true goal is not the stigmatized groups they've discredited and persecuted, but the entire society that will be watching this public execution. Their goal is to carry out acts of information terrorism aimed at undermining society, destabilizing the situation in the country, and ultimately destroying democracy.
One of the tactics used by anti-cultists is to justify the unwarranted persecution of modern religious organizations by citing historical examples where certain extremist groups, labeled as cults, committed real crimes. From these isolated cases, a false conclusion is drawn about the danger of all new religious movements without exception, regardless of their origin, goals, or values. The method of guilt by association is a manipulative tactic where the targeted organization is intentionally linked or associated with negative images of extremist groups, terrorist organizations, criminals, and dictators who are already viewed negatively by the public. This tactic is further amplified by a deliberate distortion of fragments of the target organization's teachings, taken out of context, which contributes to the demonization of the group's image. As a result, an aura of danger is deliberately created around the undesirable organizations and their members, accusing them of crimes despite the lack of direct evidence of any harmful activities. Such actions by representatives of anti-cult organizations denote a complete violation of the presumption of innocence, as proclaimed by Article 11 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that every person has the inherent right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty according to law. Violating the presumption of innocence is an illegal act aimed at spreading intentional slander and misleading the public.